With that, I get to introduce um, Brett Barker is a history professor at the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point and the various campuses. And he is a long-term friend of the Historical Society here in Marathon County, and it's my pleasure to introduce him and his topic here. So with that, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Ben. Well, welcome everyone. And today I want to talk about the Grand Army of the Republic and its role in American history. And I'd start by saying the Civil War, and especially how it's remembered by Americans, it remains an important and sometimes controversial issue in our culture today. So I guess it's appropriate to look today at an organization that sought to shape the memory of the war for the 75 years after its close, and an organization that worked tirelessly to both ensure that Americans remembered the role of ordinary soldiers and cared for them. So let's talk about the Grand Army of the Republic, and I'll usually be calling it the G.A.R. from here on in, which they did as well. One note about sort of my focus today, the G.A.R. was a national organization, but I will admit that some of the things I'm going to say today are a little more specific to Wisconsin and Marathon County because I think that might interest you even more and maybe give a little bit more of a local flair to what I'm saying here today. So, the idea of a veterans organization, nearly 2 million men served in the Union armies during the Civil War, and about 1.6 million of them returned home, surviving the war. So, in some ways, it's hardly surprising that some of these men would want to stay in touch. And so, the idea of a veterans organization might arise somewhere. And as I think about this veteran organization, I often think about these men and their life, where they are in their lives. And I think that explains a lot about the way this organization grew and then sort of faltered for a while and then rebounded. So, the Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR, was first founded in 1866 in Springfield, Illinois. Maybe not so surprisingly, the adult home of Abraham Lincoln. It was founded early in 1866, but in that same year, Wisconsin had a department. That is, Wisconsin had set up a sort of state department of the national organization and was proud of the fact it was probably the first state to fully organize in that way. And in the years between 1866 and 1869, there's a flurry of activity. There are at least 51 posts in Wisconsin, hundreds nationwide. And if you think about it, this makes a lot of sense. First of all, camaraderie is definitely a reason. A lot of those soldiers had spent 4 years of their lives, as much as 4 years of their lives together. They had been through one of the most intense and important experiences of their life. So it's not surprising that they'd want to stay in touch after the war. At the same time, early on, this first early flurry of activity in the 1860s also definitely had a political bent to it, as would the second coming, but the first group definitely had a sort of a political basis too. Reconstruction was still going on in the South, and many of those Union veterans wanted to make sure that what they had done and the results of that war that they had won came to full fruition in the years after the war. Certainly by in 1865, Confederate armies have surrendered and the Union had been put back together. But the exact nature of how the South would come back into the Union was something a lot of these veterans cared about. Many of them wanted to make sure that when the South came back in, it would come in terms of complete loyalty and there would not be a need to fight a later war over the same issue again. And a lot of Northerners, particularly in the upper Midwest and parts of New England, were very concerned about what the role of African Americans would be now that slavery was ended. And they wanted to see that blacks had at least a basic um, chance at life. This is not to say that most of them were for full equality. I think that would be giving basically those white veterans too much credit, but that they wanted to see that blacks had basic civil rights and had a chance to work hard and get ahead. I think many of those Union soldiers genuinely wanted that. They had found again and again that blacks in the South, whether freed blacks or the slaves themselves who were becoming freed people, were the only sure allies they'd had. And many of them had fond recollections of where they had been saved by a black person if the white soldier had strayed from their unit. Some of them had served with other black soldiers in the Union Army in groups called the United States Colored Troops, the USCT. And many of them did care about some basic human rights for Black Americans. Certainly, probably most of them not for social and political equality. That's, again, giving them a bit too much credit. But they did want to see that Reconstruction did not founder and did not go away. Locally, the first post in Marathon County, the only one in this first section, was created in Wausau in 1868. It's called Post 83 at the time. Most posts had both a number, and then some of them had a sort of a nickname. They generally were named after someone noteworthy in the war, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. Another major goal of this first incarnation of the Grand Army of the Republic was also in commemorating the Union dead. There was a strong interest in making sure that the sacrifice of their fellow comrades who had not come home from the war was remembered and memorialized. This would prove one of the main goals and actually one of the main accomplishments of this first incarnation of the G.A.R. In 1868, the national commander, sometimes called the commander-in-chief, but the national commander of the Grand Army of the Republic, a man named John Logan, who had been a general in the war and would serve as G.A.R. commander from 1868 to 1871, issued a proclamation stating that the last May 30th should be commemorated as what he began to call Memorial Day, sometimes also called Decoration Day, particularly in the South early on. But the Memorial Day should be a day in which the sacrifices of the Union war dead, in particular, although over time this becomes transformed into the sacrifice of all U.S. veterans, would be commemorated and their graves would be memorialized and remembered, often with picnics, parades, trips to the cemetery. It was very fashionable for young women to go and decorate the graves of soldiers, as you can see a picture here from later in the 19th century. That's a very common thing. And in some ways, much of what we now come to understand as Memorial Day, a large part of that lies in Logan's proclamation as commander of the G.A.R. in 1868. It is not the only way that came to be about, but it was an important factor in creating a major national holiday that we continue to celebrate to this day. Now, those were some of the stated goals of the first part of the first incarnation of the G.A.R., and those were all real and really important. But I think one that's not stated but was also very important in this first part had to do with adjustment back to civilian life. Many of these men had served years together in the Union Army, and then the war had ended, and very quickly they went back to civilian life. And I think that we sometimes underestimate just how hard that was a transition. Some men were certainly happy that they'd survived the war, and their transition, they came home to a welcoming public, but that still is a difficult transition. A lot of these were young men who had left for the war, fairly young and naive, not really set up in life, and they came home now having to decide a lot of major decisions, and some of them frankly struggled, both because of what they'd seen in the war and also in making this adjustment back to life, civilian life. And I think a lot of them found camaraderie with their fellow veterans. One of the ways in which, because their fellow veterans had truly had the same war experience, sometimes there was something of a disconnect with the way civilians had experienced the war. Soldiers could get together and talk about the war experiences in a way they sometimes didn't feel comfortable speaking to their even to their family, but certainly to people who had spent the war as civilians on the Northern Home Front. Now, this can be overstated, though. One of the things that you have to understand about Civil War armies is that most companies, that is the group of 100 men that formed the backbone of regiments which formed the Union Army, often came from a single community. That wasn't as true in more remote places like Marathon County, but in many places, a company had an identity with the community. And that probably helped the transition back to civilian life because they were surrounded by men they'd served with. They all went back to the same community and started their lives again. But in the short term, there were probably things that needed to be discussed. And there's a lot of evidence that for a few years, this was a very important factor in what was going on. And think about it. These men are also often in their 20s and 30s in this first incarnation. They spend a couple of years in this adjustment, and those years of 1866, 67, 68, and 69 are ones of great activity within the GAR. But then interest and participation in the Grand Army of the Republic began to wane. And maybe that's natural. Many of these soldiers, who again are now in their 20s and some of them beginning to approach their 30s, get very busy in life. They have families to deal with. They're getting married. They're starting to have children. They're deciding on their careers. What is their work looking like? They're getting into busy. It's a very busy pattern in people's lives. And many people don't have as many social activities, don't have as many, today we would say, hobbies, sort of during their 20s and 30s as they sort of get themselves going in life. And I think the same thing happened to those veterans. Indeed, by the late 1860s, the Wausau chapter of the GAR was declining. In 1871, it actually had its charter rescinded for inactivity. So they just weren't holding meetings regularly, and the post basically went into sort of eclipse very quickly. And I think we can sort of understand what's going on. Now, a few of these chapters struggle on. The national organization survives. It continue to have national conventions that aren't overly well attended, but they're not really a national force in politics during most of the 1870s. The second phase of the Grand Army of the Republic really happened, well, partly Wisconsin is part of the story, but it's more of a spontaneous thing too. And it really coalesces around something that happened in 1880. In 1880, Wisconsin veterans decided to hold something that would be called the National Soldiers and Sailors Reunion. And it was called for Milwaukee, and they asked that all Wisconsin veterans come to this celebration. It had been roughly 20 years since the election of Lincoln and what followed soon as the outbreak of the war. And they were asked if they wanted to participate, and they were asked to send in responses of whether they would attend this event or not in Milwaukee. And I think it's sort of telling. The invitation said this: "Comrades, attend to this at once, or we shall not know whether you are dead, proud, or gone to Texas." And in some ways, that's sort of a funny way to sort of get people to respond, and I understand that. But I think there's something also important embedded in that little throwaway line that they asked people to respond to. I want to know if you're still living. Are you still with us? Are our veterans, maybe we've lost touch with people. Are you still out there? Are you proud? Have you moved away? Do you not want to have this connection with us anymore? Are you gone to Texas? Many people in Wisconsin and elsewhere had begun to move. The westward movement continued. There were new opportunities in the West and elsewhere, and a lot of folks had begun to travel and leave that community where they had entered the war from and where they'd often returned to at the end of the war. And so as veterans were becoming more dispersed. And so I think for all those reasons, there was a need by the 1880s to find out where everybody was and to sort of reassemble. They'd been off living their lives, but now there was time to come back. And the organizers of this event proved accurate because there was a huge response. So many veterans from Wisconsin responded and said they wanted to come that eventually the invitation was spread sort of at the last minute, but still to all Union veterans. It was spread to a nationwide call. Everyone could come to Milwaukee in 1880 and be part of this reunion. It became quite the event. 40,000 Union veterans showed up in Milwaukee. Generals Grant and Sheridan showed up to be honored. Even old Abe the War Eagle, you may know that this mascot of the 8th Wisconsin Infantry, this bald eagle, who had accompanied the 8th Wisconsin Regiment during the war and was now living in the state capital, was brought out to Milwaukee and was a big hit at this event. And in many ways, this was the impetus for the revitalization. But I think the response shows that it was just waiting for a catalyst. That this huge response shows that a lot of veterans have been thinking about these things. And so the energy is rekindled, and suddenly hundreds of posts are either founded or sort of start up again. By 1889, so by the end of the decade, in the 1880s and 90s will be the high point for this second incarnation of the GAR. By 1889, Wisconsin had 264 GAR posts and 14,000 members. And that's sort of remarkable if you consider that 92,000 Wisconsin men had gone off to war and probably fewer than 80,000 came back, and many of them, of course, have dispersed in the years afterwards. So this is a quite a large membership, and they began to form permanent posts. And I have here a list of the posts that are the G.A.R. posts that were in Marathon County. I previously mentioned Wausau's post that had been disbanded in 1871. Now a new post is formed, Post 55, the Cutler Post, and it would be in effect from 1882 to 1931. Spencer would have a post that had a brief. You can see that sort of early enthusiasm in the 1880s. It exists from 1883 to 1887, has a down period, but then is reconstituted in 1895. Unity has a post for 10 years, again at the very height of the G.A.R., even Unity. And Colby had one, technically that's a Clark County post, but Colby is in Marathon County, and I'm sure many of the veterans who attended were from Marathon County. So the post 112 was in effect, and it remained around until formally 1931, although I couldn't find much trace of it after the 1880s, but maybe in name at least, it survived into the 20th century. These were much more active posts. They had larger memberships. Their meetings were held more regularly. The state and national conventions became much better attended again. They went back to some of the same purposes we see before, but also some new ones. First of all, I think that commemoration is really important in this second incarnation of the G.A.R. for one very important reason. And I want everybody out there to think about this moment in time and compare yourself to veterans in 1880. So this is 20 years after the war. And they now know young people who have no memory of the Civil War. It occurred to me that last Saturday, we commemorated the 20th anniversary of 9/11. I have students who do not remember 9/11. If you were a veteran of the Civil War and you're now having children and meeting people on the street who don't remember the war and don't remember your sacrifice, that's probably exactly the moment when you understand the significance of commemorating what you and your comrades did. So the 1880s seems that perfect moment. It's the 20th anniversary, and it would be a time very similar to where we are in relationship to 9/11. Those new posts, as I said, were kindled. It's interesting that one of the things that's interesting, I was talking to Ben before we get started, Lysander Cutler, many of the posts are named after more significant soldiers, generals, and the like. People fought over who got to be the Abraham Lincoln Post in many states. But I'm touched by two of them from Marathon County. Spencer is named after Henry Watrous, who died during the Civil War. Was a member of the 4th Wisconsin Cavalry, and the Colby Post is also named after someone from the 4th Wisconsin Cavalry who died during the Civil War in service. Many of the veterans of the 4th Wisconsin Cavalry settled after the war in southwestern and western Marathon County, and so when they decided to pick a name, they did not choose a former commander of the Iron Brigade or Abraham Lincoln. They chose one of their fallen comrades, and I think that also speaks to the way in which they're trying to invoke the memory, maybe in the way their commemoration is an act of survivor's guilt, that their commemoration is a way of trying to give meaning and trying to make sure that their comrades who didn't get to come home, who didn't get to start a new life and start a family and start a business, were remembered for what they had done during the Civil War. So commemoration, I think, is incredibly important. I think that reunions and reconnections are also a very important reason for getting back together. A third thing that the second incarnation does is there's a strong move to create a place where Wisconsin veterans who need help can be cared for. And in 1887, the Wisconsin G.A.R. began to fund and eventually gave quite a bit of money to the new soldiers' home in King, Wisconsin, which still exists in a different, obviously in a very different form to this day. And so they were really they were the original, you could think of as the seed money for what became the soldiers' home in King. And that was very important to them. And think about this, now after 20 years, they're starting to enter into their 40s and 50s, which was considered even older back then than we probably would consider today. They're starting to think about the end of their lives too. They're thinking about what old age may hold for them, right? Um, so one other thing that's sort of interesting when we talk about both the way in which the war continues to touch their lives and the way it's commemorated is I do want to tell one story from the war, probably the most famous thing. Well, John Logan's proclamation about Memorial Day is a very important moment for a commander of the G.A.R. But the other, probably most significant one, was something I'll come back to in a minute, is another one done by a national commander of the Grand Army of the Republic who was actually from Wisconsin, Lucius Fairchild. He was from Madison. He had gone off to war. He'd served in the Iron Brigade. He'd lost his left arm at Gettysburg, which he sort of proudly displays in this portrait by John Singer Sargent. In 1886-87, he was the national commander of the Grand Army of the Republic. And President Cleveland, at that point, had decided that confiscated and captured Confederate battle flags should be returned to those former Confederate states, that the time had come to help heal and return those battle flags to the southern states as a way, as a sort of a gesture of healing. And we might look at that and say, well, yes, 20 years have passed, 25 years have passed, since the war. Feelings have probably dulled down a little bit. Well, when the Grand Army of the Republic found out that the president was thinking of doing this, there was outrage. And Fairchild famously gave a speech in which he said, "May God palsy the hand that wrote that order," speaking about Cleveland. "May God palsy the mind that conceived it. May God palsy the tongue that dictated it." Now, you may think that that's a little harsh to hope someone has a stroke, essentially, because they dared to return Confederate battle flags. But I think it does speak to the passion that many of these soldiers still felt about the war and its memory. And he was widely popular amongst the G.A.R. for this statement. Some people in the larger society thought that more bygones should be bygones. He did not, and the G.A.R. largely did not. And to speak to their power, when he, not just this speech, Fairchild can't do it on his own, but because of the outcry of all those G.A.R. posts all over the North, those battle flags were not returned to southern states. They would not be returned to southern states until the 20th century because of the power of the G.A.R. And that is another thing to say about the G.A.R., particularly in the Second Coming. There is a real political force. They are, in fact, have almost a veto power over Republican nominations for office, everywhere from the city level to the national level. If you want to be a Republican politician in the United States in the 1880s and the 1890s, you must have the blessing of the Grand Army of the Republic or you are sunk. And they held a great deal of power, as you can see in this single instance. There's a lot of ways to talk about that, but to me, that maybe is a very clear case. They could more or less countermand an order of the President of the United States with their combined political force. There is one last thing that the Second G.A.R. basically engaged in, and that was seeking pensions for Civil War soldiers. Now, this is a long and complex, probably its own talk in its own, but I think what we need to focus on for the G.A.R. is this. There had been Civil War pensions even during the Civil War for men who had been permanently disabled and sometimes for family members where a soldier had died and they were dependent on the soldier. So pensions had existed in a very limited form back to nearly the beginning of the war. But they'd been very few in number, and it was very hard to receive one. There had been a little bit of a more generous offer of pensions in 1879 with with a new pension bill that said soldiers who felt that they had been wrongly denied a pension or back pay even from the war could now apply for it and could possibly get some funds. And this is in some ways acknowledgement both of the power of the G.A.R., but also the growing sense that there ought to be some way to reward Civil War soldiers. They had received their $13 a month pay, that's to be sure, but that is really what they got out of the war. Many people think that they received land grants. That's not the case. You didn't receive land because of your Civil War service. The Homestead Act had made that unnecessary. Many men went west. And while it was sometimes easier to qualify quickly for a homestead if you'd been a veteran, for the most part, everyone who went west could do that. So some politicians began to think, well, this might be a very useful thing to do, would be to make pensions a little easier for these soldiers to get, because not only is that politically probably useful, but as these men age, they probably could use a little something in their old as they start to grow older. And so in 1879, there had been a little bit in the Arrears of Pensions Act, there had been a little bit of liberalization of back pensions, but it was still fairly difficult to get. But in some ways, and Stuart McConnell, who wrote probably the best book on the G.A.R. called Glorious Contentment, argues that that 1879 timing is not completely coincidental, that having gotten a little taste of the idea of pensions, that may also be a factor in the revitalization of the G.A.R. after 1880 in seeking pensions. There might be some truth to that. I think everything else I talked about was also a factor. When the 1880s, the G.A.R. continued to press for a more liberal pension policy. In 1887, Grover Cleveland, who was already not popular with the G.A.R. because of his attempt to give back the Confederate battle flags, then went and vetoed a new pension bill that was going through Congress. And this outraged G.A.R. members even further. And they went out in 1888 and voted in large numbers for Benjamin Harrison, the Republican candidate. Many of you may know this little triviality of American history, that Cleveland is both our 22nd and 24th president, because he'd been elected in 1884, but then lost to Harrison in 1888 and was reelected in 1892. It is not hard to look at the numbers and see that that loss in 1888 could easily have been from either his decision to give the battle flags back, which ended up not happening, but he made the order, and the vetoing of the pension bill. He lost by very narrow margins in Indiana and New York, which were more dependably Democratic than a lot of other northern states. He lost them in 1888 and lost the presidency to Harrison. He lost both of them by just a few thousand votes. So it's possible that these issues helped sway the election of 1888 and probably helped Benjamin Harrison be elected in that year over Grover Cleveland. Well, the bill came back up for consideration in the Congress after Harrison's election, and after some wrangling over the details, exactly who should qualify, what the rules should be, in 1890, the pension bill was enacted, the one that really opened the floodgates for Civil War veterans to receive a pension. No longer did they have to prove a disability in service, but some knowledge of disability that they could even claim they were having now and might have some vague relationship to their war service was now considered evidence. And there were pension agents and lawyers who became expert in knowing exactly how to write these applications so that they were approved. And the number of Civil War pensions grew by leaps and bounds. They'd been very limited before 1890. They, as I said, the 1879 Act made them a little more common. But let's look at just how common they became. So because of the 1879 Act, the number of Civil War pensions had risen to 537,000 by 1890. But just 3 years later, the number of Union pensions had risen to 966,000, nearly a million. And I think a really significant fact to consider is even though originally this was only $8 a month to a Union veteran, by 1894, pensions constituted 37% of the federal budget. It was a major expenditure. And one of the things I often think about is those are mostly going to Northerners. I mean, certainly some Union veterans had moved to the South, but mostly it's going to Northerners. And that is a redistribution of federal funds to the North. And so it is true that the Southern economy was slow to innovate, that it remained deeply embedded in sort of a plantation cotton agriculture. But a lot of funds are also flowing to the North through the pension system, and I wonder if that isn't at least some small part of what's going on. To give you some idea of how this continued, the other good numbers I found, and I found them for Wisconsin too, which I thought was interesting, is by 1914, and now think about this, Civil War soldiers are now probably in their 70s, and maybe well into their 70s, maybe their 80s. There were still 779,000 pensioners in the United States, and it received $171 million, which was still 24% of the federal budget in 1914 on the eve of World War One. And in Wisconsin, there were 19,000 pensioners who were receiving $4.2 million. So the pensions were a major way in which Civil War veterans and their widows could continue, and sometimes their children too. Children with disabilities of soldiers could continue to claim a pension for the rest of their life, for instance. This was, by the way, the whole question about disability and proving that. By 1904, Teddy Roosevelt issued a proclamation that said that anyone over the age of 62, said be anybody born after 1842, which would only have put you in your 20s if you served in the Civil War, any Civil War veteran over 62 automatically now qualified for the federal pension. And so they didn't even have to go through the paperwork and sort of claiming some sort of vague gastric distress, which was what a lot of them claimed, or something like that. I had a relative who claimed to have fallen on the butt of his rifle during a march and was never quite the same, and he received a pension for that. So, but then even that is gone after 1904, and any Civil War veteran who was at least 62 years old automatically. So now, in some ways, old age is now considered sort of a disability when that comes to that. When it comes to that matter, right? One last thing about pensions. I mentioned that disabled children of Union veterans could claim a Civil War pension for the rest of their life. The last such person to claim a Civil War pension was Irene Triplett. Her father, Mose, was a veteran of the Union Army. She was a disabled child of his and therefore lifetime eligible. Irene died in June of 2020 at the age of 90. Her father had been 84 when she was born. So the last Civil War pension to a dependent of a Civil War soldier stopped being paid last year. The Civil War seems a long time ago, and yet one of my themes for the rest of the talk is really, it is a long time ago, and yet in some ways it isn't. So let me just keep talking about a little bit more about that. A little bit more about the G.A.R. First of all, for commemoration, I do want to go back a minute. I kind of changed the way I did this a little bit, but I want to go back. Ben Clark gave an excellent talk on this that you can find on our YouTube channel about the Cutler Post Memorial in downtown Wausau. This is a picture of it, of the Cutler Post Memorial. This is the one that you may have seen. They are everywhere. I've seen the one in Stevens Point. They are in hundreds and hundreds of communities throughout the North. They often take a form similar to this. They are omnipresent. I would encourage you to go. There's a site called Historical Marker Database that lists them, and you can just look at the hundreds of them scattered. You can put in a location. It'll tell you the ones that are closer. They are all over the North as a way of commemorating the Union Army and the United States, the North's role in the Civil War. And I always get asked, by the way, and Ben mentioned this talk, but I want to mention it today. I've been asked by several people over the years, underneath the soldier, you see the letters FCL, and people always ask me what that stands for, and they are remarkably wrong in their guesses because it's not intuitive. You know, it is the motto of the Grand Army of the Republic was fraternity, charity, and oh my gosh, the loyalty, right? And so that's what the FCL is. I suddenly thought liberty, but it's loyalty. And so that's what FCL is. So many people who on walks go by the courthouse now and see that. They often ask me, what is it? Is that I've been asked many times, was that the initials of the soldier that posed for the statue? No, it's the motto of the Grand Army of the Republic. So just in case you're wondering about that. A couple other things about the G.A.R. that I think are interesting on a national level. First of all, we know of at least 2 women who were admitted to the Grand Army of the Republic. One was a Rhode Island a woman named Katie Brownwell who fought with her husband at First Bull Run and later got involved in a campaign. She went along with her husband on an expedition in North Carolina and saw service there. She was admitted. And Sarah Edmonds, who's one of the most famous of the small number of women who disguised themselves as men and fought as men during the Civil War under the assumed name of Franklin Thompson. She was from Michigan. She was also given formal membership. What's interesting is many of her, who would soon be her comrades in the G.A.R., wrote affidavits testifying to her service, and that's how she eventually, I believe, also received a pension, but regained full membership into the Grand Army of the Republic. That is not the only role that women played in the Grand Army of the Republic. There were also two auxiliary organizations. It's kind of interesting that there was even a little bit of a conflict about the organizations. There's the Women's Relief Corps, which any woman could basically belong to. And there was also the Ladies Auxiliary of the G.A.R. You usually see on little buttons and things that will say Ladies G.A.R. You had to be a family member of a veteran to be in a Ladies G.A.R. But those were both auxiliaries, sort of, they often worked along with G.R. Post, sometimes in things like, certainly they were important in Memorial Day, but also in raising funds for these statues and these other memorials. This is also a time, and this goes beyond this talk, but it's also a time when the soldiers decided where they wanted to place monuments on the great battles they had fought in. And they needed to raise money for those monuments. If they wanted to place one at Gettysburg or Shiloh or Chickamauga, they would raise money in that way. And the Women's Relief Corps and the Ladies Auxiliary of the G.R. were also very important in that. One last thing that's an interesting topic about the G.A.R. is there were black members. So African American soldiers, about 200,000 of them fought in the Union Army in segregated units called the United States Colored Troops. Here we see a veteran, a member of the G.A.R. He's wearing many of his badges, much like the badge I had on at the beginning and on the screen at the beginning of the program. The traditional view had been that they were often in segregated units. They were put into segregated G.A.R. posts to keep from offending particularly white Southerners and posts in the border states and in the South. And there were G.A.R. posts in the South where enough Union veterans had moved to South, or in some cases were Unionists during the war. There were posts in the South. And the traditional view had always been that this was to keep from offending or maybe leading to violence amongst white Southerners, that they were segregated. And some of that did happen, but a book written about 10 years ago really makes a convincing argument that that's where there are enough black veterans to really form a viable post on their own. And in that case, sometimes they preferred that because they could then sort of manage affairs, do what they wanted to do. If they wanted to raise money for a monument to the United States Colored Troops, they could do it, right? And that made their white brethren who might want to work with them might not be interested in that project. The other thing is, what is increasingly clear is that in communities where there were not many black veterans, and those that were in the North, they were almost always allowed to belong to the main part. It was not a segregated organization. It was, in fact, one of the few organizations that was not always segregated in that time period. And it seems that, again, it goes back to this service, that camaraderie of service in some ways sort of trumped what was undoubtedly this white supremacy that was most virulent in the South under Jim Crow, but also existed in Northern society as well. It seems that with white soldiers, they recognized and applauded what their black brethren had done in the war, and they had worked together, and that they did not allow that kind of segregation to occur. In many Northern communities, there were integrated G.A.R. posts, which for the time period is unusual and rather remarkable. The other thing that's sort of interesting, as she says in the book, is that generally there's a sense that in the late 19th century, many Civil War veterans began to downplay the role of slavery. This is particularly true of Confederates, but even some Union, downplay the role of slavery and talk about a brothers' war. And some veterans started holding joint reunions, Confederates and Unions together. And this was seen as the predominant view. But in her book, this author really makes the case that many G.A.R. Post members do not do that. They understand that slavery was part of the war and that they still hold some grudges, which maybe you can tell from the Fairchild quote. And so that may not have been as prevalent amongst veterans as we once thought. There may still have been a sense that they understood that they were fighting, particularly in places that have been more anti slavery, like Wisconsin and parts of Ohio, New York, and New England, that they knew exactly what the war was about. And they did not forget that. They did not whitewash the war in the late 19th century in the way that is often assumed. A couple of things about the G.A.R. and how it continued to go. Wisconsin held 4 national conventions of the G.A.R., 3 of them in Milwaukee, 1 in Madison. That was held in 1937, and sort of this starts to introduce the sort of end of my tale. By 1937, only 192 veterans attended the national convention. Think about that. By 1837, you would likely to be in your late 80s or early 90s by that point. And so it's no wonder that not many veterans would make that journey from all over the United States. The state G.A.R. convention was held in Wausau in 1915. 3 G.A.R. commanders were from Wisconsin, and 8 governors belonged to the G.A.R. One of the sure paths to political participation in the Republican Party after the war, also an office holding, was to have been a Civil War soldier, and that is held out, that's sort of borne out by those 8. So let me talk about the end of the G.A.R. A post was closed when the last member died. And I want to put up on here the Cutler Post closed in 1931 when James Young died. This is a newspaper clipping from the Wausau paper at the time, sort of pointing out the passing of the last veteran. It mentions, interestingly, that 3 former members of the Post still remained alive, but they no longer lived anywhere near Wausau. One lived in Milwaukee, one lived somewhere else in Wisconsin, one was living in Los Angeles. So there were still some veterans who had once lived in Marathon County, but he was the last active member of the G.A.R. Post. So when James Young died in 1931, the Cutler Post of the G.A.R. formally closed. Let me continue that story out. The last Marathon County veteran that we know of was Henry Peter Vollard of Marathon, town of Marathon, who died in April of 1939. Now we're getting closer to that's within living memory, right? As is 1931 for some people. The last Wisconsin veteran was a man named Lansing Wilcox of Cadott. I didn't put that on here, but he lived in Cadott. He died in September of 1951. Now I imagine there could be somebody watching quite easily who remembers 1951. So now we're getting closer. And the last Union veteran, Albert Wilson of Duluth, died in August 1856. He had been a member of his local G.A.R. post, so formally in 1956, the Grand Army of the Republic ceased to be a living, active organization with his death. That was commemorated in Wausau. Some veterans of the Spanish-American, the First World War, and Second World War showed up. They had a ceremony in Albert Wilson's honor. The newspaper article mentioned that 4 of the 6 remaining veterans of the Spanish-American War in Wausau showed up for that event. And so with that, the G.A.R. passed from memory. So what in the end should we make of the Grand Army of the Republic? They influenced national elections. They could overrule a presidential order. They helped create Memorial Day. They helped create the Wisconsin Veterans Home at King. And they left thousands of markers like the one at our courthouse, so that in the hopes that they would not be forgotten. In the words of one of their number, in their youth, their hearts were touched with fire, and they believed that they had done one of the most important things of their lives by serving the Union and help bringing a new birth of freedom to the country that they loved. They deserve to be remembered. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you, Brett. Cool. So I'm going to turn it over now. If anybody watching has any questions for Brett about the Grand Army of the Republic, or any of the stuff that we talked about here, I guess I could, while we're giving you the chance to type something out, if you have any of these. Let's see. I was gonna see what's a good starting point here. Well, one of the things I thought might be helpful if I'm someone doing genealogy or just interested and I want to know more about the GAR and maybe local members, where would you suggest people? Is there a good repository or good resources out there that you think might people would be useful?
There is, well, one thing I sort of, because I was trying to come in at about 45 minutes, which I think I did a pretty good job of. So eventually, because there's no one left in the GAR itself thinks about who they want to convey this duty to. And they decide upon an organization called the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War. And they have a website which has some information on it. They continue to be something that if you have an ancestor who fought in the Civil War for the North, you can become a member of that society. They have some records online. The other thing is, I'd say go to your local historical society. I know we have information on Marathon County, the G.A.R. Post. That's actually where I got this newspaper clipping from. We have some information. The other thing I would say that if you're thinking about researching your Civil War veteran, trying to find out that one thing to find out their service would be there are rosters, but there also the Wisconsin Veterans Museum has a database where you can search by name and find them there. So there are a lot of resources in that way. I don't know of a great sort of detailed how to find out the GR records unless your local or state historical society has a collection on the GR, which they might well have. There's no easily accessible site that I'm fully aware of. And a lot of things scattered by the internet. So if you want to be brave and Google Grand Army of the Republic, once you take out the Star Wars references, you'll probably find some things that are of use. And particularly if you find the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, SUVCW.org. That's a good they're a very dependable website. Anything that has a Wisconsin Veterans Museum.org URL, I think that's also very dependable. Good information you're going to get there.
So I guess just kind of getting back into the story that you were talking about, I'm curious what, obviously the GAR had a huge impact on national policy. Did that translate, outside of voting for president or whatever? Obviously there are some places that this is going to matter more if you, had the signing off of your campaign by the GAR in a place like Wausau or in Marathon County, in which it's probably not going to. Was there other things that they were doing in terms of affecting policy, or was that mostly a regional or a national thing?
They definitely influence Republican politics. I think even if you want to run for mayor of Wausau as a Republican, you need the GAR support for that.
Okay, yeah.
I mean, that's partly fundraising, but it's also getting the vote out. It's voter mobilization. There are also very much issues about things like commemoration, about what the things like they do set up. There is a GAR plot over in Pine Grove. There's an area that has a GAR marker and a big, not surprisingly, a red granite stone. And veterans of the Union veterans are buried around it. Many of them served in did not serve in Wisconsin regiments, but it's interesting to go over there and find that. So they basically also followed most Republican policies at the time. So they'd be in favor of things like the gold standard and tariffs and things like that. They did also sometimes work for other things, but they mostly focused on things that they saw as more pertinent to veterans. So pensions were always a big issue, making sure that pensioners got what they deserved. That sort of thing is really where a lot of their focus was. And there's a little bit, and I suggest this somewhat, but also they spent a lot of time engaging in social events too. They'll tend to have sort of fundraising events, but also things like a ball once a year is often fairly common in a lot of communities. Sometimes they would build a memorial hall in a town where they would put memorabilia from the war and sort of memories of the war. There was a large GAR hall eventually in Madison. It started in the state capitol and then burned. Oh boy, I know our state capitol burned a few times. It was the 1904 fire. The GR hall the GR rooms are lost during one of the state capitol fires, and they then build a separate building for a while, and I think they're housed in that. And that occurs throughout the North. There are a fair number of GR memorial halls.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
just take a moment here
Sure.
to plug. Since you mentioned the Pine Grove Cemetery, it's a good time to mention. If you're not aware, this coming weekend, on the Sunday, the September 26th, so it's next Sunday,
Mhm.
we're actually going to be once again doing our living history. Um, there's a Voices from the Past is what we're calling what we call it, our cemetery tours. So that's from 11 a.m. to 2 p.m. If you want to get out, walk through, you have a nice, hopefully nice day to walk through the cemetery and learn about some local figures. Look out for that. But I don't think we're going to be talking about any Civil War
I
era
didn't
veterans
know.
this time,
No.
but some Spanish American War guys and other people too. So yeah, that's
But
always a
you can
good
see
time.
the headstones. They are marked. They're a specific type that to this day a Union veteran can have. The federal government will place or replace a marker, the standard marker for service in the Civil War. If you find the G.A.R. plot, you'll see several of those around. So there's definitely are quite a few veterans buried in Pine Grove.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Let's see if I got any other ones here. I think you covered a lot of this. And I don't see that there's hasn't any questions in the chat here, but
Okay.
um, so I think maybe we'll call that there. Thanks again,
All
Brett.
right.
As always, it's a great hearing sharing your expertise and your knowledge about this very interesting topic. And of course, thanks to all of you for tuning in on this. Nice Saturday. We hope that you will join us again next month. We're going to be talking about some apples and botany and all of that. So if that's an interesting topic, sure come back for that. And yeah, in the meantime, have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see.